In 2024, the Washington State Legislature asked a critical question: are the state's contracting structures sustainable for human service providers? As a result, the Department of Commerce then contracted with Atrómitos to find out. Over the course of 9 months, we engaged with human service providers across the state, evaluated practices in other states and municipalities, and examined the literature. We also collaborated with a group of diverse statewide experts, referred to as the work group, to develop the study's framework, analyze data, and develop actionable recommendations for the legislature. The findings of the study were sobering. National studies show that 1 in 8 human service providers are technically insolvent, and a third report less than 1 month of cash reserves. If we apply that in Washington State, it's really important to understand the impact on the human service sector. In Washington, the human service sector provides 65,000 jobs and delivers essential services like foster care, housing assistance, food banks, domestic violence shelters, employment services, and legal aid in every community. Our interactions with human service providers throughout Washington revealed that more than 80% reported their state contracts covered 75% or less of their actual costs. Today, I'm joined by Michealle Gady and Jacob Ferrari, 2 subject matter experts who served on the work group. Together, we're going to unpack the findings, explain why they matter, and explore what the state legislature can do to improve the sustainability of the human services sector. Michealle, tell us about your practice at BDO and your work with nonprofits. What led you to volunteer to serve as a subject matter expert on this work group?
Hi, Michelle. Thank you for inviting me to be on this podcast for you today, because this is a really, really important subject for us in the nonprofit sector. At BDO, I am the practice leader for the Seattle Assurance practice and work primarily on audits with nonprofit organizations, primarily human services organizations, as well as several behavioral healthcare organizations. Spending a lot of time in this sector, I see the critical need for adequate and full funding for my clients, as well as other people I know across the nonprofit sector. So because I see this direct impact on a daily basis, I really felt like we need to do something here and we need to fix this because the problem is only getting worse. So when I was asked to volunteer to help out with this project, I was really glad to step up and hopefully serve the nonprofit sector and indirectly all the people that they serve.
Mm-hmm. Jacob, same question to you. Describe your practice at the Apex Law Group and what drew you to this project.
Yeah, sure. And Michelle, thanks for having me here. I'm glad to be here. I'm a partner at the Apex Law Group. We're a small boutique firm based in Seattle, and a large majority of our clients are nonprofit organizations. My entire practice is based around nonprofit organizations, helping nonprofit organizations and special issues around tax exemption. So my clients are often coming to me regarding funding issues, how they can use the legal process to get funding issues. Oftentimes I'm actually feel at a sort of a logger jam with my job, because I have to tell them the legal ramifications or the legal barriers to getting funding rather than essentially giving them new ideas to get funding. So joining this work group was very special to me to figure out new ways that I can utilize my expertise and actually getting my clients better opportunities.
So you both spent 9 months reviewing reports and other resources, attending work group meetings, and engaging in what were sometimes tense discussions. What was the most important thing you learned through this process? Jacob, let's start with you.
For me, I think patience is key. I think you have situations like this where you have just very different stakeholders having different interests in mind, but all, when you come to realize that they're all here to help nonprofits in one way or another, you sort of have to realize that it takes patience, it takes listening, it takes figuring out what are the common grounds that we can utilize in order to get sort of the best result for nonprofits and human service providers in the state of Washington. I'm saying nonprofits, really human service providers in the state of Washington. And that was the thing I had to learn. I'm not a patient person. I like results. I like to push, here and now. I like to be an attorney that's mean. And in this case, I had to be quiet and put on my listening ears.
Michealle, what about you?
I was just constantly amazed by the passion of the leaders in our nonprofits, especially our human services sector. They're on the front lines working every single day, and they see really hard stuff. So when their hands are tied behind their back because of the contractual terms and the funding issues, it's just making things harder. And I think, especially in those moments where things got heated, I also really thought about how this is a complicated issue and there is no one single fix. There's multiple things at work here. And I think that's also really reflected in our report as well, with the number of recommendations we have. And I truly believe that the recommendations we provided to the state, if those are acted upon, will make a really big difference for the human services sector. But I think if we were only to say do one or two of those things, we won't really see the desired impact, because there's just a really complex network and a lot of diverse needs. And so, it's complicated, and the people working in it are really passionate. So that's a good thing.
Yes. So, Michealle, what did surprise you or challenge your assumptions during this process?
So, I guess, I was very familiar with these issues going into it, but overall, what stood out to me the most is how many variations there are. Even within single granting agencies within the state, it's so nuanced, and it's almost like they customize every contract and add a special flavor of what this particular organization has to do. So one organization's experiences and what they're living with can be completely different than another one, even though on the surface they look very similar or look like they should be very similar. But when you really dive into the details and the ramifications, they can be really different. And I think even for somebody who works with these contracts on a daily basis, I was still surprised by the differences from organization and contract to contract.
Jacob, what about you?
Yeah, I think I almost have the same response, except for also on the state agency side, how different they can be and how they respond to requests for contracts, requests for grants, and how they utilize their processes. It was astounding to me that there wasn't an established standard process in the state of Washington across the board, that every agency sort of acts in their own way. And obviously that made things more difficult, but it was surprising.
I think one of the more surprising things for me, honestly, was related to the technology and finding out that some of the barriers for state agencies and, paying and contracting had more to do with what their technology would allow them to do with payment systems that are 40 years old and rely on COBOL. And I think everybody who knows that language is retired. All right, so let's dig into the findings. The report identifies financial hardships as the primary threat to sector sustainability. Not surprising. So, Michealle, I'm going to focus this segment on you, as these are fundamentally kind of accounting and fiscal management issues. But Jacob, do feel free to jump in.
Got it.
So Michealle, the report calls cost-based reimbursement the primary reason for inadequate payment. So can you explain this payment model, what it is, and why it presents challenges for human service providers?
Yeah. I think on the surface, cost reimbursement sounds so simple and logical, right? You have costs for carrying out a particular program. You get those costs reimbursed, easy peasy. You should be made whole. But when you really dive into what that looks like in the real world, again, it gets really complicated really fast. And then to further layer in, nearly all contracts with the state have very specific detailed budgets and certain costs that are allowable or not allowed to be charged to the grant. And if you also really take back and think about the diverse types of costs that are incurred by an organization working in the human services sector, tracking all of those costs, submitting them for reimbursement, and then actually getting paid ends up being a very time consuming and long process. So, just to give an example to help illustrate this, if you think about an organization that's serving people experiencing homelessness, there's going to be a lot of salary and benefit costs, of course, for the people working inside the program. But then there's a whole variety of other costs that might be more difficult to track and separate out. Thinking about insurance for the organization, incidental costs related to serving the people, housing costs, maybe motel or hotel stays, food. It can get really granular really quickly. And sorting all of that out takes a lot of time. And then when you multiply that out by multiple different grants and funding sources, because again, most of our human service providers are working with multiple different grants and contracts. So they have to divvy out every single expense between every grant or every contract that they're working with. It gets really detailed. Then to layer more on it, I'm going to say most of these contracts have very, very detailed template invoices that are required to be submitted before the nonprofit can be repaid for the costs they've incurred. So typically these are line by line invoices of every single cost incurred. And oftentimes the nonprofit even has to attach copies of their invoices and proof that they've paid these costs. So it's not uncommon that if you were to print out these invoices, you would just have a stack of paper. And I've seen that many times throughout the course of my career. Of course, today it's mostly electronic, so it kind of hides, behind emails and everything. So we don't always realize just the volume of data that goes into this. Then the contracting agency or the granting agency reviews all of that, asks questions, sometimes rejects certain expenses. There might be discussion back and forth before final payment is determined and made. So as you can imagine, from the time that a nonprofit starts incurring expenses related to that particular program, like I said, serving people experiencing homeless, so the time they're actually paid for those costs, oftentimes 90 or even 120 days is going by before they can gather all the details, sort it between their contracts, submit those detailed invoices, go back and forth with the granting agency, and then ultimately get paid. So it's a really long and cumbersome process when you open it up and look under the hood.
And that assumes it all goes well from the beginning. So even if it's gone the way that it's supposed to, it still can take that extended period of time.
Right.
And then when things don't go well, how much longer can it take from there? I can imagine that's quite extensive.
Absolutely.
So related to that, the report found, so not only is there sort of these delays in payment and the complexity in demonstrating that you're due the payment, the report found that a large majority of the providers are being paid essentially 75% or less of the actual costs that they incur in providing the contracted human services. So from your perspective, what are the impacts on a community-based organization operating at that funding level year after year?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just like you can imagine with your own personal budget, if you're only getting 75 cents for every dollar that you actually need, you're constantly running behind, right? So you're not able to fully deliver services. You need to fundraise in other ways to help fill that gap. So I think nonprofits are constantly underfunded, which makes it so they can't reinvest in themselves. They can't buy new technology. And ultimately, as we've seen over the years, this has led to decreased efficiency and I think even less impactful programs because our nonprofits are just constantly running behind. They don't have the resources they need to really fulfill the services that are needed in our community.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, Michealle is completely right, and the other thing is there's not messaging around this, right? It's not nonprofits are sort of given the indication that they'll get 100% of what they ask for, if they're under this contract, and they're not budgeting with the assumption that they're only going to get 75%, and it just gets into that same rat race that Michealle was talking about.
Yeah. So it is interesting, and I think that this was this concept that I'm going to ask you about, Michealle. I think was I encountered some folks on the work group that kind of struggled with this idea of direct and indirect payments. And what do you mean there's not like one kind of payment where everything is covered? So let's talk about indirect costs specifically, because I think this is a pretty significant difference that human service provider organizations encounter when contracting with the state than what other types of state contractors experience. So the report states that agencies, so state agencies, typically pay between 0 and 10% for indirect costs, when indirect costs actually fall between 25 and 35%. So, can you explain what indirect costs are and why this reimbursement gap matters?
Absolutely. And I can totally understand why this gets to be a confusing area because there's not a hard and fast rule of what type of cost falls in the direct bucket versus the indirect bucket. So, any cost that is incurred directly for a particular program or a particular grant and then directly reimbursed. So, typically, we think about the types of costs that would not have been incurred if that program was not going to happen. So, it might be an additional staff member and their salaries. It could be rent on a particular location used for a particular program. And then the indirect costs are everything else that does not have that direct relationship to a particular grant or a particular program. So that might be your management costs, your HR costs, or just other things that are harder to attribute to a particular program. So if you have multiple programs operating out of the same building, rent might be an indirect cost because it needs to be allocated or somehow attributed across multiple programs. So one category of cost could be both direct and indirect, depending on how your program is structured and how your costs are structured. So I think that's where it gets really confusing for many people is they're like, wait, I thought you said rent was an indirect cost. Now you're telling me it's a direct cost. And the answer is it could be both.
Right.
So it's not always a hard and fast line. But if you look at the typical cost structure of any organization, whether it's a nonprofit human service provider or a company who's helping build roads, everybody has direct and indirect costs. And every single program requires a level of administration and management to effectively run, right? Management wouldn't exist if it wasn't needed. Nobody really wants management, I guess you could say. But it's
Just let me do my
essential to an effective program to have people in charge and people running it.
Mhm.
And if you look at the cost structure of any company, you're going to see probably at least 25% of overhead or indirect costs or whatever terminology you want to use around that. But for some reason, there's a long legacy where in the nonprofit sector, overhead is bad and it's consistently underfunded or not funded at all. So in so many different government grants, including those from the state of Washington, they specifically say, hey, we don't pay your indirect costs. We don't pay your overhead costs. We only pay for the direct costs of running this program. So that leaves out your management costs, your HR costs, your IT costs. And it also leaves out anything that's just more difficult to attribute to a specific program, even if it is directly attributable. So a lot of times it leaves out smaller things. And so, again, it's just constantly adding into what we just talked about with the average nonprofit getting about 75 cents on the dollar for the costs that are incurred related to a program versus what they're actually getting paid.
Mhm. So one of the things that we recommended, the work group ended up recommending in the report to kind of address this idea of indirect is kind of a 3-tiered indirect cost rate system, similar to the one that's used in New York City. How could this approach be beneficial for Washington State?
Yeah. This is one of the recommendations I really like because it's a complete void in the current Washington State contracting and granting process. It's just really not addressed currently. And I like that it has easy to access options for smaller organizations or newer organizations that maybe don't have the history to build up a negotiated rate. So the three options that we identified, and again, this is similar to New York City, is a flat de minimis rate that would probably be 15%, which is also consistent with federal standards. So any organization contracting with the state could use that 15% rate with no further discussion or negotiation required. So it's very easy to access. And clearly 15% is better than the zero that we see in many current contracts. For other organizations that also have federal funding and a negotiated indirect cost rate that is used federally, they could use that exact same rate with the state. So again, it limits the back and forth and negotiation required as part of the contracting process. And then the third option that would be available to organizations would be to negotiate a rate directly with the state of Washington, which is a great option for organizations that don't have federal awards and don't have a previously negotiated federal rate, which we see a lot in the state of Washington, where there's a lot of organizations, probably the vast majority, that don't have a federally negotiated rate. But it gives them that third option to negotiate a higher rate above a de minimis rate like that 15%. So the way I see this playing out is that, especially for newer agencies or agencies that are newer to contracting with the state, they could use that 15% in the beginning. And then as they build out their cost structure and better understand their cost structure, they could negotiate an appropriate rate with the state that fully covers their costs. The other thing I would add on to this that wasn't directly addressed in our report is that there really should be a cushion of the costs that are identified as direct and indirect costs. When the state contracts with like a construction company to build a road or something like that, there's always a profit margin built in. And currently in the nonprofit community, not only is there no profit margin or no cushion between the directly identified costs and what's being paid, they're being paid at a discount. So that, again, feeds into this starvation cycle for nonprofits where there's never any money left over from the costs that they're incurring on a daily basis for their programs to invest in bettering the organization through better technology and better processes, staff training. All of those kinds of things just don't get paid for and often just don't get done. So I think there should also be some cushion built in there.
I think that's a really important point. These organizations tend to be, for the vast majority of them are nonprofit, but nonprofit doesn't mean no margin.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Margin isn't just about profit. Margin is also about investing in the organization, investing in your team, professional development, new IT systems, raises,
Yes.
those kinds of things. But there's this really long and entrenched idea that nonprofit organizations are charities and they don't need to have any money to run the organization. And the organization is, in fact, a business. It's a nonprofit business. And so there's this whole need to kind of shift that mindset.
Absolutely.
So kind of carrying that along, I think what we've talked about so far is kind of the cost reimbursement model, the underpayment, the indirect issues. Really, this all comes down to a payment structure that has pretty significant impact on the organization's cash flow. And so can you kind of talk us through what that looks like, how organizations deal with it, what the impact is?
Yeah, it's honestly really terrible, especially for our smaller or newer organizations that don't have a cushion. They really can't afford to upfront the cash for these programs and then wait 90 plus days to be reimbursed by the state. I mean, you can only imagine from a personal perspective. I mean, we're seeing this right now with the federal shutdown. We're hearing of federal workers who are not being paid, which means, they go one paycheck and they can't pay their rent. They can't pay their mortgage. I just heard that the food bank in Bremerton is extending their hours so federal workers who are still required to work, by the way, can come in after work and get food. And, it's really the exact same situation for our human service providers. the food bank being one of those human service providers where there is no cash, no spare cash to supplement this. So often nonprofits end up working on lines of credit, which of course adds to cost because they're paying interest or other fees. And again, it just feeds into that continual lack of investment in the sector because there's never any extra cash. There's barely enough cash to cover the costs as it is to just pay the bills as they come due, and why so many nonprofits are technically insolvent.
So according to the recently released 2025 State of Nonprofit Sector Survey, which was done by the Nonprofit Finance Fund, 55% of nonprofits receiving government funding reported being paid late, with 11% noting average payment delays longer than 90 days. So we found similar results in our Washington State analysis. Can you talk through the ripple effects of late payments to human service providers that are contracting with government agencies?
Yeah. I mean, really, the longer it takes to receive payment, the more negative the impacts. And so when we're seeing a pretty significant portion of organizations being paid consistently 90 days or later, I mean, 11% is a lot. That's not a small amount. It means, again, that they're leveraging other sources of cash that they might have available. So either they're robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. So they're using cash they receive from one thing to cover another, and they're, constantly moving around the deck chairs on the Titanic. They're drawing on lines of credit. And I think the other thing that we see very consistently in the sector, but I don't think a lot of people fully understand, is that philanthropy is absolutely required to make up the difference in what our government contracts are not paying for. So oftentimes the services being provided through our human service organizations are required services from the government that are basically just being privatized. So by law, the government has to provide many of these services, but they're shortchanging the organizations who are providing these required services. And private citizens are then being asked to make up the difference through philanthropy. So funds that are given freely that should be going to other things are being used to make up the difference of what our governments are not paying for but required to be doing.
And then kind of thinking outside of the organization itself, into the community where they get services from businesses within their community, the impact of late payments to the human service provider has late payments to those around them who they're working with, and then the ability to follow through on the services that they're meant to be providing. And so it has this kind of continuous ripple through the community that isn't really thought of.
Right. Absolutely.
So kind of related to addressing cash flow and trying to get ahead of some of these payment delays, one of the key recommendations in the report was allowing state agencies to make advance payments to human service providers. So, Michealle, how would advance payments help the sustainability of human service providers?
Yeah. I will say before I dive into this was another area that surprised me because I know that advance payments are not typically done. I don't see them very often. But there was a perception among many of the people within state agencies that they're actually illegal in the state of Washington. And as we dove into that, I think we found that probably is not true. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not providing legal advice. That's Jacob. But
I have thoughts.
The belief.
I have thoughts.
The government that this is an illegal thing to do was shocking to me. But Jacob, I'll turn that one back to you in a second. But I really think that moving some of that funding in advance would go a long ways in helping nonprofits cover their cash flow. Again, this is only a partial fix because if they're not being paid fully for the services providing, you're still going to end up with a deficit at the end, and that's going to be a problem that will come around sooner rather than later. But at least we're not adding to that deficit through those late payments.
And so, Jacob, building on what Michealle said, many state agencies cited advance payments as being unconstitutional within the state of Washington. So, can you talk about that? Kind of what are the legal issues in Washington, and explaining how we found that in this particular case they're probably not unconstitutional.
Yeah, it was shocking to me too, just as Michealle, that I knew they weren't favored. The fact that that was my first time learning that most agencies saw them as illegal, and even up to the point of unconstitutional. What was shocking. So just to sort of lay it out, our Constitution, Washington Constitution, Article 8, Section 5, and Section 7, they basically have this, what we call the gift of public funds doctrine, which basically says the government won't gift money to public individuals, essentially unless they're doing some sort of government function and providing a government service. A statute sort of reiterates that point. It's RCW 4388-160, which specifically says advance payments won't be given unless there are certain circumstances where it will, but it essentially says that they won't be, advance payments won't be given in order to maintain the gift of public funds doctrine. It's a shocking sort of idea that just because you're giving an agency or an organization money before they actually do the service, that's somehow considered a gift. The minute I heard this, I was ranting to my people in my firm saying, I give money to Amazon and I don't have my product yet. I wait for that product to come. I don't consider that a gift to Amazon. I consider that a bargain to sale in which I get my thing. But somehow the state legislature has interpreted that to say, no, we won't give you money until you actually do the service, and we'll give it to you in reimbursement rather than advanced payment. It's when someone lays out a constitutional burden, it's almost insurmountable, which really does put organizations at a disadvantage. How do you argue with a state agency when they're saying, hey, it's unconstitutional? They're just going to say, change the Constitution. Okay, I'll get right on that. So it is a high burden, and certainly not one I agree with in interpretation. Quite honestly, I don't think it's a gift. I think advance payments are just a bargain for consideration for a service to be provided.
Mm-hmm. So, continuing on the legal issues, Jacob, in addition to the financial constraints, the report identifies many systemic structural barriers in the contracting framework in that process. So, from a legal standpoint, what are the most significant structural problems human service providers face, from the state procurement, that process all the way down to the contracting process?
Yeah, I think one of the most significant that's probably sort of reiterative in all of the things we talked about was the dynamics between the parties. You essentially have small service provider organizations, small to mid-size, entering into service grants and agreements with large state agencies. I mean, that come with the resources of Washington State, and they have the power of the Attorney General to stand by their side and negotiate these contracts. And they have to stand toe to toe with them and actually negotiate these contracts and somehow develop funding out of it that meets their needs, when the state agency sort of acts as, has the perspective of we're a counterparty and we're going to try and get that contract in the best interests of us, the agency, or us, the government. It's a tall order to expect these organizations to stand toe to toe in that realm. I think one other thing that was shocking in the task group was we had multiple state agency representatives saying, well, the organization can just negotiate that. To which I think at one point I did sort of speak up, can they? When I advise organizations, I don't think I've ever advised them, hey, let's just, fight against Department of Commerce on this one. Oftentimes you're sort of given these contracts of, you're just giving them and you're expected to go with them. And that's really your only option. Especially when you have small organizations that maybe just started, high upfront costs. I advise clients all the time that when you're starting a nonprofit, you're starting a business, it's going to take a lot of investment on the front end. You have this, you don't even have your 501c3 status maybe. That takes a lot of time and effort too. Then to expect them to sort of, go toe to toe with you as some sort of equal counterparty in a huge negotiation, it's just not reasonable. And it's a high bar that these organizations have to meet.
That's exactly right. One of the things that we found that was quite surprising. I'm somebody who does contract negotiations for clients, and to hear from human service providers who have long contracted with state agencies that they honestly and genuinely believed that they were not permitted to negotiate contracts. So where do you think that comes from? Why do you think people think that?
So we often say that everything's negotiable, right? In my life, I can go into JCPenney and grab a shirt and try to negotiate with the clerk. It's not going to go that well, right? That's not going to necessarily happen. And I think even furthermore, that's true in the Department of Commerce. I mean, they say we can negotiate, but if you actually look at some of the preventatives of an agency negotiating, it's not exactly like they're very actually permissive to negotiate. I mean, oftentimes the requirements are, then the agency can negotiate as long as the price comes down, right? The statute says, like, as long as the price comes down, you can negotiate it. So you can't negotiate the price up. Right. So to say that you're allowed to negotiate is, it's not exactly as at face value that, yes, you can negotiate, right? There are statutory barriers to negotiation. And second of all, I think it's, again, just a power dynamic. I think when all these organizations have these ginormous dreams of having grants from state agencies, that's sort of the end all. Once it's granted to them, that's what they want. And why would they negotiate it? You're giving them the price. It's ideal. Like I want that money that you're giving me, and you're giving me the money. What's to negotiate until after they get into it and they realize, oh, this is not actually what I expected. This was made out to be a little bit easier than I thought. And again, I'm not trying to make it sound like the agencies are frauding people. I just think people don't have the right expectations going in because there's not enough education out there to show them what this is like.
Right. Or even thinking beyond, kind of price negotiation, like the requirements of insurance and
reporting
and
requirements, like that, all of the things that they're expected to do with it, part of this contract relationship. When they hear the term grant, and again, we're going to talk about definitions of grant as well.
Yeah.
They hear the word grant. Oh, that just means I get money from the government, and they probably expect me to tell them that I used it right. And if only, right?
So on that, the report outlines pretty extensive compliance requirements, reporting requirements, insurance, et cetera. Audits sometimes can be required. So Jacob, what are the reasons for these requirements? And what are human service provider clients sharing with you about these requirements? Where are their concerns?
So in looking at the most optimistic reason for these requirements is really the agencies have to be good stewards with taxpayer funds. They have to ensure that taxpayer money is going to where it needs to go and being utilized for public services. So oftentimes mechanisms are used for that: monitoring, audits, insurance, reporting, all that we've talked about. Sometimes it starts out when the authorizing statute or the authorizing agency first put out these funds. It started out as a small sort of requirement, maybe just reporting. Then maybe something happened and there was a problem, and some funds were used for things that the taxpayer got word of. So a new requirement was put on, and then a new requirement was put on. It kind of builds and builds, honestly, without probably intentionally looking at, well, maybe that first thing is just not very effective. We should take that out and add it, and add a more effective, more efficient thing. But, looking at in the best context it is to protect taxpayer funds. And I think most of us will understand that. But what my clients are telling me is that it's extremely onerous. I mean, they want to be doing the good work of serving people, providing healthcare, providing resources in foster care, all of these things. But half their job is spent reporting to one government agency when they have other funders actually that they have to respond to as well. And they all want different, requirements. Every agency has a different form to fill out, and they have to do it in a certain amount of time.
Yeah. Sometimes
Michealle,
sometimes I wonder if you really took a step back and looked at how much the government is spending on monitoring and compliance, if paying for a little fraud, waste, and abuse might be cheaper. That might sound like a really crazy thing to say here, but I mean,
as the attorney, can I say that?
Look at the requirements here. I'm like, is this actively like actually effective or efficient, or is like all of this compliance actually the waste of taxpayer dollars?
Sure.
Because we're just adding a huge burden to our government employees as well as our service providers. And it's really just not doing anybody any good.
Yeah.
One of the municipalities, I forget which city or county it was, the Department of Human Service director said something like, I literally have 7 people in my office right now doing contract compliance and taking, from, different state agencies in my office right now, taking the time of my staff who are supposed to be doing the services, and one program could have 10 different state contracts that are supporting it. And so they're different state contracts. And so it's the same program, but they have different reporting requirements. So that's a lot to administer. So Jacob, you mentioned, one of the other important things in the report that was recommended was defining terms like grant and human services and human service provider. Why does doing that matter?
So there's two different kind of sort of roles there. Defining grants really important, and I'll go back to an anecdote of me 2 years into my work here at Apex. Very naive, very thinking I know everything. I got my partner gave me, Jake, there's this grant agreement from Commerce. We need to analyze it for our client. I was expecting it's a grant. It's money we got. What do we want to do here? And my partner sort of laughed at me. She was like, "Okay, you read it and you tell me if it's a grant." I read it. I'm like, "Isn't this just an independent contractor agreement?" And that's she's like, people think they're going to Department of Commerce, Department of Health and Human Services, expecting to get grant money that is just a donation with maybe some contingencies attached to it, but nothing that says like they actually need to do a service in response to something and actually prove that. What they get is an independent contractor agreement, and they're now expected to meet certain deadlines, certain benchmarks, and they need to hit those no matter what, even whether that was what their proposal was or not. So it's really important that we define grant in all the statutes across. I even note in RCW 2403, which is the nonprofit statute, which is the one I live in, grant's not defined. And grant should be defined. It should be defined in some way to make sure that people have an appropriate understanding of what to expect when they actually contract with state agencies and otherwise. Human service and human service provider, really important as well, especially when we talk about the constitutional limitations, the statutory limitations. I did mention that there is caveats in the constitutional provision that say, for government services or essential government services, that though advance payments can be used. A lot of the programs that we're dealing with here, human service provider programs, a lot of times they can be classified as essential government services. I mean, we're talking about foster care. We're talking about health and human safety, things the government is reliant on. And quite honestly, if the government is contracting with these organizations, I would assume that it is an essential government service, or else why would the government be contracting with them? So again, having that definition in the statute to, I don't know if you want to say argue against the state agency, or at least give the state agency some rest to say that you can grant us money beforehand because it's not a constitutional issue. That's important.
Michealle, kind of going back to what Jacob was talking about, the difference between a grant and a service contract. From an accounting perspective, those distinctions are important, aren't they?
Yeah. So they fall under different standards for how the revenue is recognized. So if you think about an exchange transaction, and this would be true for any business, you would recognize your revenue as you provide the goods or services. So Amazon recognizes revenue when they ship you those goods, and their obligation has been fulfilled. With a grant, it's recognized under the same guidance as a contribution. And a contribution is recognized when an unconditional promise to give is made. So typically a grant or a contribution is recognized as revenue upfront. And the idea is that with a grant or a contribution, the nonprofit really has a lot of latitude to use that funding for their programs and in the way they see fits their programs the best. But what we actually see with our state agencies and the grants, I'm using air quotes when I say grants, is that they're
Mm-hmm.
contracts, like Jacob said, and they have very specific requirements of what the government is expecting in exchange for that payment. So they're called grants. They're in some ways written like grants, but when you really read the contracts, they are an exchange for services provided, but at a
Mm-hmm.
significant discount to what it
That's
actually
right.
costs to provide those services
Yeah.
on behalf of the government. So I just see it as a
Yeah.
really problematic situation when we label something to be a grant or more like a contribution, but they're actually essential government services.
Mm-hmm. And what we found is from state agency to state agency, how they interpret and use the terms grant or service contract differs. And it could even differ within department to department of the same agency. And so one of the agencies, as an example, and I can't remember which one right now, they use the term service contract for anything that's contracted for the agency. So a service provided to the agency. But they use the term grant if it's a service provided outside of the agency, so to a population within a community. That's their distinction between one or the other, but no other agency does that. So that's going back, Jacob, to the point you made earlier about the vast differences across the agencies. So we're talking about contracting systems and structures, which is a little esoteric for people who aren't us. But so, what are the real world impacts on organizations, staffs, and communities related to this? So, Michealle, when these systems don't work, when funding is inadequate and compliance is overwhelming, who actually bears the cost of that?
Honestly, it's all of us. I could tell a lot of different stories that I've seen where organizations I work with were just trying to help and just trying to do their job. But on the back end, the compliance requirements were so strict, the budgets were so rigid, they couldn't be paid for that. So a couple of years ago, this is actually an organization I'm on the board for, came across a family who was experiencing homelessness and without shelter on a Friday night. It was raining, it was dark. It's, winter in the Pacific Northwest. It's dark and raining. But I think we can all very much agree that's not a safe environment for a family to be in. This is a family with kids. And again, it was a Friday night. The grant that they had hoped would fund this service required pre-approval before you could put people in a hotel and charge it to that grant. Of course, nobody could be contacted on this Friday evening. So the program manager made the decision to put this family up in a hotel room and make sure that they were safe for the evening and not outside in the rain.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that granting agency came back and said, no, we won't pay for this. You didn't get pre-approval. So even though the pre-approval was sought, and I firmly believe that program manager made the right call and got that family off of the street, that organization was not reimbursed for that. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
as people, as citizens, we can all agree we don't want families sleeping outside in the rain. And unfortunately, that nonprofit had to eat that cost and find other ways to cover it, even though I think we can all agree they did the right thing. They did what they should have done. They tried to follow the contract and, frankly, couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think anybody you talk to in the human services sector can provide so many examples of situations like that, where it's like, we're just trying to help people and we're constantly hindered by the compliance requirements that we're required to follow. We're, doing the best we can, but we're fighting this fight with our hands tied behind our back. And I think, honestly, this is a big reason why we continue to see high rates of homelessness and, people end up back in the situation that we try so hard to get them out of because there's such strict limitations on funding. Another one we run into a lot in the human services world is that homelessness is defined. But if you're couch surfing and,
Mm-hmm.
moving between apartment, and sleeping on your friend's couch, you are not by definition homeless, which means you don't qualify for a lot of the help out there. And so as much as somebody would love to help you and say, like, let's get you set up into some safe and stable housing, they can't. They don't have the funding for it. And I think we can all agree that's kind of silly, but that's the world we live in. So ultimately, it's a lack of effectiveness.
Anything you'd add, Jacob?
Yeah, I really, I mean, it's the communities that are harmed, just like Michealle was saying. It's the communities and everyone that's harmed. But the one I want to add, though, is I mean, we all fall into this trap, and I think agencies are maybe more so than others, we fall into this trap of assuming nonprofits are an entity in and of themselves, as if there's some sort of corporation or business that, if they get harmed, well, it's just the organization that got harmed. We forget that nonprofits, they stem out of communities. The whole point of a nonprofit, usually, and especially human service providing nonprofits, they are there stemming out of a community to fulfill a community need, and to sort of view nonprofits as sort of this monolith, as if you're viewing any for-profit organization. It's just in my opinion, a mistaken mindset. We really need to be viewing them as direct offshoots of what a community is. Perhaps one aspect of a community, but still, when you harm a nonprofit, you're probably harming an aspect of that community.
The community. Yeah. So the report emphasizes the impacts of all of this on by and for organizations. And I'm often asked, what does that even mean, by and for? So what we're talking about here are organizations that are led by and for typically historically marginalized communities. So Jacob, how are these barriers affecting diverse types of organizations?
Yeah, the way I would put it is that it's all of the issues we've been talking about, but on steroids, right? The marginalized communities, such as BIPOC-led BIPOC communities, BIPOC-led organizations, they often find it more difficult than their non-marginalized counterparts to seek other forms of funding, institutional funding, bank loans that would normally, by the statistics, are just not delivered to them as much as their white counterparts, quite honestly. So they rely on this government funding more so than anybody else. The government funding obviously has strict limitations around what could look like discriminatory practices. So they rely on this funding, as their literal lifeblood. And when they're harmed by these practices and procedures that we have here, oftentimes they're just never going to get off the ground. I represent a lot of human service providing organizations within certain communities. Think of there's a lot of health organizations in, say, the Iraqi community or even the broader Middle East community in Seattle, and they all seem very small. And it's like, how is this so small when it's providing such a huge service to these underserved populations? And really, that's it, because oftentimes you look at it, unfortunately, they haven't gotten the funding from other sources that you would normally expect. And they're sitting here waiting, sort of cap in hand, from the government to actually provide the funding they're not getting otherwise. And it's hard. It's a really hard position for these organizations.
Michealle, what do you hear from by and for led organizations?
I think that for people who are pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, which is, purposely an impossible task. That's the point of that saying.
Ever tried it?
Yeah, if you ever tried to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you might find it impossible, but that's the point of the saying. So I think we have these groups of people who are trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and there's just constantly barriers, and they often can't see the barrier until they have run into it. You've run full force into that sliding glass door, like that poor bird. And so they can't plan for it and they can't navigate it. And there is no education. There is no, hey, let me help you. Here's a hot tip of how to navigate this, or here are the rules that aren't written down, but you need to follow. A lot of that information is passed down from generation to generation by people who've been navigating this system for years. So, when we think about our immigrant communities, for example, these folks are new to the United States and they don't understand our systems. They come from very different cultural backgrounds. And so they're expected to navigate a really complicated system that they've never been a part of. They were not raised in this system. They don't understand it. And they have no way to, right? And there is no class you can take on this. There is no technical assistance like you've recommended be enacted, Michelle.
Yeah.
There's just barrier after barrier holding them back, even more so than just the complicated reporting and reimbursement. And then, I mean, just to add on to this, we've talked about the cash flow problems that exist within so many of our human services organizations, but with smaller community-led programs, there's even less cash, right? Like these are communities that have been negatively impacted by these same systems that we're talking about. And so they have even less money up front to help navigate this. And sometimes they're put out of business because of a lack of cash flow before that business even gets off the ground. And it's really sad to see people pouring their heart and soul into work that they know needs to be done. They see this in their community every day, and they can't fix it no matter how hard they try.
Michelle, if I can do one more.
Yeah.
The other thing I was just thinking of, quite honestly, we have to also remember it's a different culture too. The coming in, I mean, the transactional culture of the West is sometimes cold and unfeeling, right? Like it's this idea of you give me something, I give you something, and we might be used to that, and like just like Michealle was saying, just we might be used to that. You know, there's generations upon generations that are used to that. Or people coming from different cultures around the world that might have a different way of doing things that's not transactionally based, that's more communal and relationally based. This is a system that doesn't necessarily, go to that. There's this concept of you give me something, I give you something. It does just exist in other places. So the law doesn't look at it that way. Agencies don't look at it that way, and that's a hard thing.
Yeah. So we are coming to the close. Couple more questions. In the report, we make 11 recommendations. So if each of you could share your top 3 and explain why you think they matter. Jacob, you want to get us started?
Yeah, top 3. I saw this question and it was hard.
Absolutely, I struggled with this one.
All of them. No, honestly, for me, the advanced payments is probably my top one. I think it is just absolutely important that we change our mindset in this realm and say you need to give organizations money up front and trust them to do the work. If you feel like they haven't done the work, then build in provisions into the contract to work around that. I do it every day of my life. You should be able to do it every day of your life agency. But the fact that these agencies are expected to do work without money in their pockets right away is just unsustainable, in my opinion. Another thing, because I am a lawyer, I do like adding definitions into statute. So I would say adding definitions of grant, adding definition of human service, I think I like it because it's easy. It really shouldn't be controversial to add those things. And I think it could be something that we can easily get through the legislature pretty fast. And then the last thing is we have this idea of adopting relational contracting, this idea that the service provider and the agency sort of have a collaborative partnership with each other, and they're sort of walking along with each other as they go to make sure that the contract, sort of uniquely conforms to the situation in through the twists and turns rather than a real straight up and down, who knows if you're going to hit that barrier or not. And I think that would be a really key piece that would require a dramatic mindset shift, though. But I think that idea would be the best.
Michealle?
Okay, this is why you always, bring a diverse group to a conversation, because we have different ideas about the top 3.
Totally.
So
Good.
My number 1, you probably wouldn't be surprised, is covering the full cost of the services being provided. And I want to add or emphasize there that the full cost should include a margin. There should be a cushion for error and reinvestment and training and all of the things that just can't be counted when we use a strict cost reimbursement with a very strict budget and all of those things. So that is my number 1, is please pay for the services that you are being provided. My number 2, I guess kind of lines up, but timely contracting and payment. We didn't really dive into this in the podcast, but I've seen this happen a number of times where organizations are asked to start providing services without a contract in place. And I've seen that turn into a problem many different times. And then, of course, also following up with payment, because I've also seen it of like, please start services. They're needed immediately, but we don't have a contract ready for you yet. Oh, by the way, we can't pay you until a contract is in place, which for all the reasons we've talked about, just doesn't work. It's not sustainable. I've seen it result in litigation. Anyway, moving on to number 3. This is actually where Jacob and I think agree, is reducing the administrative burden and using relational contracting. And, you know, this might be surprising coming from the accountant and the auditor in the room, but I'm just here to say that filling out a spreadsheet and submitting all of your invoices is really not a way to prove that the service has been provided. It only proves that the costs were incurred, not that anything effective was actually accomplished. But if we use the relational contracting approach and a relational monitoring approach, I think our government agencies would see what is actually happening in the community and whether the desired outcome is actually being achieved. I was just listening to the news and, you know, talking about the whole healthcare and the premiums and everything that's being debated right now with the government shutdown. And the gentleman they were interviewing was saying, you know, healthcare's broken. We focus on costs, but not health outcomes. We need to focus on actually improving health, not just paying for services. And I think it's a similar mentality here, that in a really good government contracting system and like really helping the people in our communities who need the help, we would rely a lot less on spreadsheets and invoices and more on seeing the work in the community and seeing the difference that's being made. Get out from behind our desk and get out there.
I'd like to say that where we differed, I just knew Michealle was going to pick those ones, so she covered them. I don't have to, you know.
We worked together to make sure we were fully covered. Whereas most of us, I guess, we only got to talk about 6 things, not 11. You know, for those who are listening, I'm going to make it a little harder.
Go ahead, Michealle.
For those who are listening to this podcast, I really want you to take a look at our report. We worked really hard on this. This was super thoughtful. Like Michelle said, it was debated over 9 months and sometimes very heated debates. But I think I hope that this really helps make some change within our state, and that we're better able to serve our communities.
Absolutely.
So at the top of the podcast, Michealle, you said, you know, we made 11 recommendations and they're all really necessary in order to fix what's broken. But, you know, legislatures work the way that they do. And so if we could get one thing done in the next 12 to 18 months, what would that one thing be for each of you?
My dream would be having the full cost plus a margin covered. That would be my one thing.
Jacob?
You know, I actually agree with Michealle, although I say I'm not sure that goes in a legislature aspect. I feel like that, but yes, if that can be taken care of by the legislature, absolutely. Otherwise, I'm going to go with my first one is I do hope that we can amend the RCWs to allow for advance payment and certainly adopt some sort of interpretation, or I don't think we're going to get a constitutional amendment in place, but adopt some sort of interpretation to say that this is not running afoul of constitutional protections.
All right. To both of you, what do you hope happens next?
That's our aspirational question for today. You know, I can see a future where our human service providers are really able to accomplish their missions and be so successful, we don't need all of them anymore. I mean, ultimately, if a nonprofit can fulfill its mission and meet the objectives and goals it set out for itself, the ideal would be to need fewer human service providers because we have a better functioning society and a better functioning community. So That probably sounds crazy today, but I'm going to put that crazy hope out there of we are so successful, we're not needed anymore.
Jacob.
Yeah, just on that, just a brief on that. I always do tell clients, like, nonprofits are those weird organizations that want to do so good that they're out, which is the weirdest thing. For me, similar though, I am sort of on a soapbox that says, like, actually probably what's needed is sort of a reduction in nonprofits. I've been very much on a soapbox of having organizations combine their leverage powers. We've talked about it a lot on this podcast, that there is an unhealthy differing balance dynamic between state agencies, large funders, and organizations. But oftentimes I say it doesn't need to be that way. Oftentimes organizations can partner with one another. They can combine, they can merge, they can do really cool things when they realize that they are bigger together than they are separate. And I've seen it happen many times. And I know nonprofits often think to themselves that a merger or some sort of combination sort of implicitly means a failure. But I am on a kick of educating that it's not. If you saw this in the for-profit realm, people pop bottles at the talk of merger and combination, and we should have that mentality here. Let's consolidate power, and let's fight the good fight together rather than apart.
Can we do podcast number 2 on that? Because I feel like we've now opened up a whole nother conversation.
Why do you think I brought it up? It's my time to let's do it.
Part 2, merger and acquisition in the nonprofit world. It's not a dirty word.
Well, we can absolutely do that. We can absolutely do that. I will put that on the agenda.
Me and Michealle work great together. We're going to bring viewers.
Well, thank you both very much.
Thank you for having us.
Helpful, informative conversation. Share the report with everybody you know.
Of course.
Absolutely.
And hopefully we get to work together again sometime in some capacity.
Absolutely.
I hope so. Podcast number 2, mergers and acquisitions. M&A.
There it is.
Here we come.
There we
go.
All
for it.
Thank you, Michealle and Jacob, for sharing your time and perspectives on the Atrómitos Way podcast today, and for the many months you devoted to the work group. Your insights have been invaluable. For our listeners and viewers, the full report is available on the Washington State Department of Commerce website and at atrómitosconsulting.com. If you're a human service provider with a state contract, I hope this conversation validated and provided a voice for what your organization has been experiencing. If you're a legislator or a policymaker, I hope our conversation clarified what needs to change. And if you're someone who cares about essential human services in your community, please reach out to your elected representatives and let them know these issues matter. Change is possible, but only if people speak up. Thanks for listening to the Atrómitos Way. Until next time.